Welcome to Killer First Lines. I just want to kind of stipulate, I say first lines, we're going to talk about first pages if you write books, we're going to talk about openings if you're doing a campaign. This is just kind of shorthand for what we're doing at the very beginning, and when we're talking for an hour, it's easier for me to give examples of first lines. So, just that stipulation. So my name is Meg Eden-Kuyat. I am a longtime MAGFest attendee and speaker, so you might have seen me before. I am a writing instructor and a writer. So I've got a few books, Post-High School Reality Quest, about a girl who thinks she's stuck in a text adventure game, and the upcoming Good Different, about a girl at a con like MAGFest who learns to find her voice and fight for accommodation needs. Yeah, so I know all about first lines, and for those of you, I know I did a panel yesterday where people ask about querying and things like that. If you are in those spaces, I am a pro at getting a bunch of rejection letters from that, and from that I've learned that openings are really important. So I'm curious first, if you guys have, like, why do you think openings are important? Does anybody have any thoughts? Yes, in the purple.
It is your first impression to your readers, to your audience. It communicates your tone, your attitude, your voice, and it's telling the person if they are only going to give you so much charity with how much they want to read your book, and you're a nobody, you may only have one or two paragraphs out of them, maybe, and if you can get them in that first sentence, they'll be willing to say, all right, if it has a boring thing in the, if there's a page that's not as interesting, I'm more willing to give it the benefit of the doubt that at some point it will be more interesting later on.
Well,
it's building that rapport with the reader by putting up what's important straight up front.
Yes, you just covered a lot of things we're going to talk about in a very succinct space, but you're basically saying that that opening is your first opportunity to really hook and to build that rapport with the reader. So yeah, when we're a book or any kind of media, there's a contract between the player and the game, between the reader and the book. If somebody could close some of those doors, that would be awesome, because I'm going to get distracted by the jam space. But there's a contract, right? And so I will keep reading if this book makes sense. I will keep playing this game if this game is fair and interesting. And so this is where we're setting up that rapport, we're setting up those rules, and we're making an argument that you should keep going. So well said, thank you. Other things that make an opening meaningful, yeah.
I know personally the way I choose books, if I read a sample or I go to Barnes & Noble and I open the first thing, I'll lose the first sentence.
Yes.
Because you don't judge a book by the cover, right? But you can't always sit down and read all of the stuff in the store before you buy it.
Yes.
So depending on what the first line is, personally that's how I buy books. If I don't like the first line, I just simply won't buy it at all. You won't even get it out of the store if that's not engaging.
Yes, that's a great point. So a lot of us buy books or just about anything from the first line. And I would argue we should not judge books by our covers, but we do, and they're designed. That's like the first line, that's where our expectation setting is. A cover's gonna say this is fantasy, or this is speculative fiction. And, if I like that, I'm gonna turn and I'm gonna maybe look at the blurb, and I'm gonna look at the first line. And I know that as somebody that has worked in submissions and reading things like that, I have no tolerance for if those first few lines aren't getting me, especially when you have hundreds and hundreds of submissions in your pool. You're looking for a reason to kind of if you're not in love, to kind of skip. Maybe one more. These are all great answers. Yes.
I really like that, even the array method, Quentin Tarantino kicking in, hey, this is an intense scene that's going on. So I kind of feel what we're going towards, and then afterwards, all right, I know what a lot of the action's gonna be this. I'm really feeling that, and then building from there. Okay, now let me figure out these characters later on.
I love that. So the opening's so important of directing us of where we're going, what's going on. That's a big thing that will pull me out of any kind of story. Games too. If I'm what the heck am I doing? Where am I supposed to go? You need that energy and momentum to pull us in and to give us a sense of like, this is generally where we're going. I'm really bad at plot. I'm getting better. So often it's hard with writing too. If you don't have a plot, you just kind of have a bunch of characters sitting in a room and you're like, okay, what's going to happen now? So starting with something that's going to give us maybe what the character wants, what's driving them, that's going to start propelling us into action. So y'all said a lot of things that we're going to talk about. As you see, we've some of these things these openings should do. One, it should hook us. I try and think about when I'm trying to find the best opening for what I'm working on, there should be something interesting, dissonant, or conflicting that makes me ask good questions that I want to find answers to. So when we're engaging with media, there's good questions and bad questions, right? Good questions are, we had a panel yesterday and my co-panelist was talking about a game where it starts with these people that are like kidnapped, and you're like, okay, who are these people? Why are they kidnapped? What's going on? Those are good questions that I want to answer and I'm going to play or read to answer. Bad questions are where I'm asking about the logic of the world, where I'm like, this doesn't make sense with what I've learned, or the grammar and spelling is off, or things that are waking me up from the dream. Those are bad questions. So we want in our opening to have our player or our reader ask good questions. And so I think about things, if there's something where I can have a good kind of confusing, where if you've seen BDG, where he has that video where he's like, what? Heck yeah, what? Like, that's what you kind of want an opening to do, where you've got like a little bit of confusion, but you've got that excitement pulling you forward. And so that moves to the next point of propelling us forward, right? Which is kind of what you were getting at, where we're getting in some action. It's really great if we can start in movement instead of, explaining things, especially if we're doing speculative work, right? We've got this new world and we've got to explain a lot of stuff, and it's really easy for us to just start and be like, let's have some narrator explain this is the world and how things work. But that's not very interesting for us. We kind of want to be thrown into the world and learn about it through action. And I think good games do this, right? So games with environmental storytelling, I think of like Dark Souls, right? Like you can slow down and learn about that world through objects. You can engage with those objects and learn a lot of deep lore. Or you can kind of move forward. So you've got some options. It's not stopping your gameplay. It's not impeding your progress forward. You can kind of choose how to engage with that. So similar with an opening, we really want to give the action, and we want to try to have the learning of the world through the action, or little spurts of details instead of just kind of a big info dump. And we see in games this lazy shorthand, right? If we have like Navi or something that's like, hello, I will come and explain everything to you. Whenever that's in the game, I'm hitting like X, 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 X. Okay, when can I play? So yeah, we want to make sure that we are not slowing our reader down. And some ways we can do that, one I kind of mentioned, character want. If you can think about what your main protagonist wants and what they're going to do about what they want, if we can establish that on like the first page or the very beginning, that's going to give us some kind of compass of where we're going. If I don't know that by the first, like when I'm reading manuscripts and I'm giving feedback, something I'll notice is if I'm like 20 pages in and I still have no idea what the heck this character wants, I'm kind of not really wanting to read forward, and I'm like, well, what's going on? So the earlier you can tell us what that protagonist wants, what they're going for, that's going to move us forward. Another way is, and kind of related, the plot really is what a protagonist wants and what they're going to do to get what they want and what's going to go in the way of what they want. But when we're opening an action, when we're opening a plot, that's going to help. A third thing is active choices. And we see this with good game design too, right? I think about Fire Emblem. There's meaningful choices when you're playing in maps, right? When you're fighting. But then Three Houses, there's a lot of non-meaningful choices when there's dialogue, right? Where there's like 3 options and they're all basically the same thing. And I'm kind of like, that's a waste of time to me because that's not really choice. So when we're having an opening, we want to make sure that we've got a protagonist that's making active choices, meaningful choices that are moving us forward. Something that really slows us down is when we have a passive protagonist that's just kind of like letting things happen. They're like, okay, cool. Okay, I guess that's happening. We want them to be moving and acting on the situation. And then finally, another thing that's really important for an opening to do is to establish authority. Again, when we've got speculative content like sci-fi and fantasy, this is particularly important. We want people to know we're in a different world. We're not like in the current world. I had one book that made me super angry for this, where the first half was like just kind of ordinary life. Like it was somebody that ran a restaurant and it was like, oh cool. And then halfway through it was like, surprise, she can smell magic in food. And I was like, what? That is not what I expected. And so like, I think you can have cool, interesting surprises, but I would have expected some seeds in the opening of like, we might get into some weird like food magic later on. So just like brace yourself. It shouldn't feel, we should feel, if we feel a surprise as a reader or player, it should be like, ah, cool, that makes sense. But like, I didn't expect it. Instead of, whoa, what the heck, I just got hit by a boulder. There's kind of like a different kind of surprise we can feel. And as I mentioned, there's that contract between, you know, the media and the one consuming media, and we want to make sure we're playing fair, that we're establishing like, we're kind of giving them a fair sense of what we're going to go into with the genre, and of course establishing authority through the logic and rules, through spelling things correctly, through, you know, some of the really basic surface level things, but also that logic and rules of the world. So I put that example of Pathfinder. My husband does Pathfinder campaigns, and one time he had a campaign where it was supposed to be in this kind of sand desert area. And so one of the things was that, you know, if you travel during the day, you're going to get sun damage. And so he needed to communicate this to the other players, but he wasn't quite sure how. And he didn't really do a great job. So when they were like, oh, we're going to go travel during the day, he was like, are you sure? And they said yes, and they did it. And then he's like, okay, you have sun damage now. And everyone, of course, raged. They were like, what the heck? We didn't know about that. That's not fair. And so we learned, if we were doing that campaign again, maybe through the environment, maybe we have them overhear someone in a tavern that says like, oh, maybe be careful traveling during the day. You probably don't want to do that. Or, you know, there's different ways where you could kind of pick it up through the environment. Maybe there's a sign. Maybe you can see out in the distance somebody traveling and it's not going well. What was that?
It was like, you put a skull there.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah, there's so many different ways you can leave those clues, which we did not do. So, and that made people not trust him then throughout the rest of the campaign. So it's really important that you're setting that logic and rules of the world from the get-go. And so by the first page or by the first whatever, it should be really clear to a reader whether this is the type of book or story for them, and if they want to keep engaging, as you were saying earlier. And I know that this is a lot that we're talking about, but when we look at examples of stuff that does this well, we're going to see that they really crunch all this stuff into a small space. So I want to give a few examples of some first lines that I think are really great, and I encourage you after MAGFest to consider, you know, what are your favorite first lines? What are your favorite openings in your favorite media and stories, and why? What makes them memorable? What do they do well? How can we learn from them? Because the best way we learn is looking at good examples of stuff. So here's one from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a great classic. And this is kind of cheating. I guess it's technically 2 sentences, but this does a really great job of establishing where we're going to be. So, far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfathomable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. So this is such phenomenal world building right from the get-go, right? So as humans, we kind of are perceiving ourselves as the center of the universe right away. This book's like, nah, the sun is, the sun is nothing, Earth is insignificant, and there's humor too of like, they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. So we're getting a sense of voice, we're getting a sense of really where we're going, and okay, we're looking at this galactic perspective. So I think that's a fantastic example of world building and setting. So I kind of know what we're getting into when we're reading this book. Now, I will disclaim, I have not yet read this book, but because of this first line, it's on my list to read. The building was on fire, and it wasn't my fault. Now, this is a fantastic example of what we talked about with good questions. I read that and I go, what? Heck yeah, what? What building's on fire? Why does the protagonist think, or the speaker think it's their fault? Or why do they think I think it's their fault? And that's starting to set some expectations of where we're going, right? I'm guessing that this person is getting blamed for a crime that they potentially didn't commit, but maybe they're an unreliable narrator. Maybe they did commit it. So I'm getting expectations, but I'm really curious of where we're going. I want to read more, and it's such a great, simple first line. So that's a fantastic example that I love. And if I forgot to say this, if you got the handout, there's more lines there. I know we ran out of handouts, so at the end, if you'd like to put your email there, I can email you the handout so you can look at a few other first lines. But this one's a fantastic one from a YA called The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. My mother is a bird. This isn't like some William Faulkner stream of consciousness metaphoric crap. My mother is literally a bird. And I love this. This is a magical realism. This sets us in magical realism, weird, wonky crap right away. That we are in a world where it is weird, but this mom's a bird, and we just got to take it for granted that that's what the story's going to be about, is this mom being a bird. So we know right away kind of the central character. It's making me wonder, had she become a bird? Clearly in this world, this is not like normal. So what happened? It gives us a sense of voice for the speaker. So I guess I've mentioned voice a couple times, and if you're somebody querying books, and you've probably heard people say, oh, voice is the most important thing, and it's such a vague, annoying word. But voice is really, it's perspective, it's language of the experience, it's taking a stance. So you see here with like William Faulkner stream of consciousness metaphorical crap, if you had a different character, they might word that a different way, right? They might use different language to describe that, but those really specific words tell me a lot about who this person is, that they're a reader, they've got some kind of sense of humor with describing it in such a way. And they're taking a stance that this is weird, that she's literally a bird. So before we move forward, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions so far? Yes.
Do you think that author bosses themselves in by naming an author like that and constricting it to, like, that one sentence is almost centered around, like, hey, if you don't know who William Faulkner is, then this might not be for you?
That's a great question. So the question is about using the specificity of the term William Faulkner there. Is that estranging your reader right away if they don't know who William Faulkner is? And I think that's a really good question. And I think you can kind of take that a couple ways. For me, that kind of sets that expectation setting of what kind of reader is going to like this book. Because it makes me think that this is somebody that, likes a lot of classic literature, and, they're going to reference people like that. And so if that's your thing, you're probably going to like this book. And if not, maybe you won't, or maybe, I don't know a lot of author names, so sometimes I just skip that and it doesn't necessarily impede my understanding. But maybe that's a turnoff if there's a lot of things like that, especially at the beginning, and you're like, I have no idea who the heck these people are, that's going to be disengaging. So I think if it's, I don't know, I don't know an exact answer, but I think there maybe is a risk that could turn off certain readers. But I think as a writer of craft, what that makes me think is I want to be careful if I have terms like that, maybe I don't have too many at the beginning to freak someone out. Like, hopefully that it will be that you can read it, and if you know it, you get it. If you don't, it's not going to impede your reading.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to add on that the way that they present it in this case is done really well, because it doesn't matter if you know who William Faulkner is, because they have these context clues.
Yes.
That they just say, this isn't some stream of consciousness metaphorical crap.
Right.
That's just, William Faulkner is just adding flavor. And so you can go and say, I don't know who this is, but this person must be frou-frou philosophical bullshit, and I get it.
Yes. So that's kind of how I feel. So he's saying this reference works because you can remove it and still understand the sentence. And so I think that that's the best way to use references. When you use the word flavor, which I think is fantastic, where, you know, it adds a little extra if you get the joke, but if you don't, it's not going to stop you from understanding the text. And this is something I try and encourage writers in general to do, that specificity is your friend. Those precise references, they're going to add that dimension and flavor. And I think often we feel like, oh, if I get too specific, it's going to scare people off, that, like you say, you know, that don't get it or whatever. But often the opposite happens. The more specific I dig into, the more often I hear people go, oh, I relate to that. Or, you know, maybe I don't relate to that specific thing, but that gave me a better sense of the experience. So specificity can be a really great tool, and it can do a lot of shorthand too. So when people do understand that reference, it adds a lot of richness. So, great. Any other final questions before we move to the next part? Is this making sense? Awesome. Okay. So, let's see, where were we going next? Okay, so I was going to give a couple examples of first lines I've used just to kind of break down where I was coming from, of like why I picked this. And often with these, actually with all of them, this was not my first line, right? So when you draft something, I want to encourage you that it's not going to be perfect that first time. You're probably going to rearrange a lot. You're probably going to throw away a lot of things, and it's all part of the learning process. So as Celeste says, when you die, like failure is learning, dying is learning. This is all good, and so I think when we write, we often feel scared of like, we got to do it perfect the first run. That's not how video games work. That's not how writing works. And so I hope that that's an encouragement to you. And so all of these, they were never the first line. So this is the first line of Post-High School Reality Quest. You are in a psychiatrist's office. No, I'm not. And so the format, you know, there's two voices there, right? It's like a text adventure game where there is a game narrating, and then there's the indentations of the player input. And I started here because when I initially got this idea, it was a bunch of characters sitting in a room. I wanted to write about my gaming community, and it was a bunch of gamers sitting in a basement playing games. Nothing happened, amazingly. So we needed something to happen, and a friend said, oh, why don't you write something that's like those old Parsley games? And if you write, you've probably had a lot of friends tell you things you should write, and you go, yeah, okay, whatever. But then one time I tried it, and I thought it was really cool, and what was helpful with that device is it started giving me conflict, right? Because there's two voices now. There's not just a protagonist, there's a protagonist in a game, and the game is telling her what she should do, and then she has to make a choice about that, right, as a protagonist. She can do what the game says, or she can disobey. And what I found as I wrote is that the player did not want to do what the game told her to do. And so I was able to start here to show that conflict right away, that we've got a game saying, this is where you are, this is what reality is, and the player is saying, no, I'm not, that's not what reality is. So my hope is that that starting in tension and conflict, for me as a writer, that was an interesting place to start. So I encourage you, when you write, to start where it's interesting and exciting to you, because if it's interesting to you, it will be interesting to other people. And starting in conflict is a really great thing to do, because as we said, the action, the want, these things are going to propel us forward. We're writing scene, we're writing a place, all that stuff's going to make us as readers want to know what happens next. And as a writer, it's actually more easy to write. Once you got something started, once you got conflict, it's pretty easy for things to lead, one thing to lead from the other once you start there. So this is an example where a new angle helped me. So again, I had a story where it was, you know, I'll read it first. So there's only one real rule in our line of work, and it's not to directly kill your client. So I had another story where it was very human-based, and nobody did anything, right? And so one of the first things I added to add tension was time. So it was about all these teens going through ruins. I'm really interested in Urban X. And so I added this element of, what if it's a man looking back on those memories of doing that as a teen? And that added tension because time is interesting, right? We can't go back in time unless we have a sci-fi or something where we can. But in the real world, unfortunately, we can't. So that added tension. I was like, okay, cool, we got some tension with time, but nothing's quite happening yet. And then I just started going off the wall, and I was like, well, what if there's a demon that's just trying to screw around with him and is trying to steal his soul, and only his daughter can see it? Now we added some conflict, right? We've got an antagonist, we got this demon screwing around with him, and the opening was boring. So I said, well, what if we got the demon's perspective on stuff? And then that really opened things. So when I had boring scenes, I went, well, what if we had the demon talk about it? And then things got interesting. So I started from the demon's perspective here, and so I like this line. One, it establishes world, right? So we're starting to learn that we are not quite, this is not, you know, a salaryman or a businessman, right? Like, this is not our typical line of work. So we're in a different world. And there's tension right away where we're talking about killing. There's also voice with taking a stance and giving us the sense of this is how things work. So those are some things to think about. And so I encourage you, if you've got something that's stale and not working, try a different perspective in the opening. Try to give a different voice and see if that makes things interesting. Maybe you see something new. I always give that exercise for my students, and one student had a story that had a tooth fairy in it. And she said, wait, what if I do the perspective of the tooth? Because it was not a human. There was like some part of the story where there was a creature that was not human, but they didn't know it. And she was like, the only one that would know is the tooth. The tooth would know, you know, it was a wolf, like a wolf tooth, not a human tooth or whatever, a werewolf tooth. And so she didn't necessarily keep that point of view in her story, but it opened things up because she was like, what does the tooth know? So no perspective is too weird. Definitely try different angles and see what you come up with. And finally, we've mentioned this character want an obstacle. This is where I did that in the first line. So this is from Good Different. The first time I broke down was in the middle of the evil place, Walmart. So this does a few things. This has got that voice and taking a stance, right? This character says Walmart is evil. Not only is it evil, it's the evil place. Walmart is terrible. So we got an opinion. This character's got an opinion about Walmart. We're in the middle of action. This person's breaking down in the first line in the middle of a public place. So, where are we going to go with that? And we can see that there's like this conflict, right? That this character does not want to be in Walmart, but they are in Walmart. Something's going to happen from that tension of a character wanting something and they're getting the opposite of what they want. So again, if you're feeling like things are stale, think about what your protagonist wants. Can you get that in the first line? Can you start there? Can you start with your character trying to get something they want, but instead getting the opposite? What's going to happen from there? And all of these, you know, they're helpful for openings, but they can also be helpful as prompts. You know, if you're just feeling stuck, try these things. Try, you know, a new point of view. Try the character want an obstacle. Try the conflict and tension. All those things are just good for kind of generating and moving forward with whatever you're trying to write. So kind of to summarize what we've talked about so far, when you're thinking about your openings, consider starting with a problem, something going wrong. If everything's going right, you're going to feel stuck writing because you're like, everything's good, this is boring. Things are interesting when there's problems, right? So think about what you could start on that's a problem. Another thing is starting in a different place. So I've had students where they brought their first line and I went, okay, what's the next line? Oh, okay, what's the next line? And then their third line was like spectacular. And I was like, oh my gosh, that should be your first one. You know, maybe that means cutting the first two. Maybe that means just kind of rearranging. Maybe that first scene was kind of boring and maybe their second scene was really interesting and exciting. So if the beginning's not quite working yet, maybe starting in a different place will give you some new energy and be stronger. As we've said several times, start in action. Have things moving. Have your characters doing stuff. It's going to be a lot easier to engage and to keep writing if you got some action. A device you can use, maybe especially if you've got a lot of explaining you're going to have to do pretty early on. Maybe you do like an in medias res, where you start in the middle of the action and then you're like, oh, you're probably wondering how I got here, you know, and then you kind of go backwards. That can be a good way to kind of hook us so we know we're going to go there and kind of wondering that as we're getting some of the explanation. As we said, start with a character want. What does your protagonist want? That should always be what's driving movement. And you probably know that if you do campaigns, each character, they're going to want things. That's probably going to influence what choices they're going to make. And you probably are keeping that in mind as you're designing things. This is probably the most critical. Start where you're excited. When I feel like, oh, this is boring, but we got to get this out of the way, I really want to get to this fun part, that's a bad sign, right? One, I probably don't need all that stuff I think I need, but if I'm bored, guaranteed y'all are going to be bored reading it. So think about where you're excited, what you want to write, and maybe that means writing out of order. Maybe it's a hot mess. First drafts are always a hot mess. That's okay. Just follow what's exciting you and what's interesting to you. And finally, reading out loud or playtesting is critical. I think of reading out loud as a kind of playtesting. Read it out loud to yourself. Where are you feeling excited when reading it? Or where are you feeling like, ooh, this is boring, I want to get to the fun part. As you're reading, watch, maybe read it to your friends or your spouse, something like that, and see how they're reacting. If they look excited or if they look kind of like they're dozing off, that's kind of a way to read what's going on the page. So those are all things I try, and I hope that that's helpful to you too. And so I think that's the main stuff I wanted to make sure to talk about. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, in the red.
As something maybe a little bit different, I'm curious how you would adapt some of these things to to more an interactive or cooperative storytelling environment like tabletop RPGs or things like that. Do you have any advice for taking this idea, which would normally be just you writing and making it into a cooperative perspective?
That's a great question. I think for openings, what's critical is making sure the players have the information they need before making their first choice. Because I assume before you give an opportunity for choice, you're laying some ground rules, right?
Right, there would be some kind of prompt, and maybe it's part of the prompt, or maybe some of these would adapt to that first choice.
Right.
And advice anywhere in there would be great.
Yeah, so the question is kind of like from the cooperative perspective, how do we think about openings and what kind of information do we give? I think, so I'll give this example. So when this book was first coming out, we thought it would be cool to make the first chapter into a Parsley-like interactive game. So we went to cons like this and we played the first chapter. And that was a very enlightening experience for me making that, because as you say, when you're writing something like a book, it's static, right? There's the binary of, will you turn the page or will you put the book down? And so I'm kind of assuming you're going to go on this path I've laid out. But when we made it into a game where it was open input, I kind of set, we're in this scene, and then kind of see what they do. People did not do what I expected. So I learned you have to put breadcrumbs of kind of hinting at what kind of choices you want them to make. You can't make it overt like Navi of oh, hey, go this way. Or unless you're doing Stanley Parable where you want there to be some opposition, where it's you better go this way, and then you have the choice to obey or disobey. So you need to think about what information does my player need to know before making choices. What kind of clues are they going to need to inform their choices, right? So I was thinking about the Pathfinder thing with the sun damage. We need to have some information about how the world works so we can make a decision whether we're going to go out into that or not. So I think one of the ways that's most helpful in that situation to give information is through environmental storytelling. So I look a lot at walking simulators like Gone Home, Edith Finch, Vanishing of Ethan Carter. How do they give information in really succinct bites through the little objects that are surrounding? So one exercise I actually do, which may be a helpful one for you to do, play the first few minutes of a game like Gone Home, just watch a Let's Play, and note what objects do we encounter in that time, and then what narrative information do we get from those objects. And you'll see within just the first 10 minutes, we learn a lot about the world, we learn a lot about the characters just through the things we see in glances. So I might think about, when you're setting up that campaign, what details should I give in kind of laying out this context for my player that can give them information in really succinct bites that they might not even realize they're absorbing that information, but that will help them make informed choices. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is, especially with cooperative storytelling, it's not necessarily a first line, right, but the idea of a first line is expanded out to a series of interactions as opposed to just one rote line.
Yes, Yes, oh, sorry, so I guess I didn't, I said this at the very, very beginning, I think before some people were in here. When I was saying killer first line, that's like the shorthand because we've got an hour and I want to give quick examples. But these principles, they apply to, first pages, openings, all sorts of different things. And I think just when you're talking cooperatively, you really want to think the first things as quick as possible before they're making those choices so that they don't go, oh, I didn't know that or whatever. Yeah. Any other questions? This is so weird having a MAGFest panel where there's not so many questions. What is this? So while you're thinking about that, I will ask another question. So in the guidebook, I said that you could bring a first line and we could talk about them. Could you raise your hand if you brought a first line? Did you find your first line? You did? Okay, awesome. So I do see a few hands. So if you want, what you want to do is if you could come up to that mic and line up, we can talk through, you can read your first line and we can kind of talk about them here. So if you want to do that, feel free to line up at the mic. Someone's got to start. Woo! Awesome. Okay, I'm going to grab a pen because I'm such a bad auditory processor. Okay. Oh God, I swear it was just working. No, you're good. Yeah, so line up if you've got a first line, and feel free to raise your hand if you've got questions of anything we haven't talked about. Yes, yes, in the back.
How do you feel about alliteration in opening lines, and should other speakers sort of like put it down and try to start doing it a lot more naturally?
So, I don't, could you say the second half of the question? I heard the alliteration part.
Should you try and edit yourself and try and cut down on doing alliteration when you find yourself doing that over the long?
Ah, okay. So the question is about like alliteration and things like that. So if you're doing that in the first line, like, is that good? Should I edit that out? So one thing I'll say is first lines, one of the things about them is expectation setting. So if I see like alliteration in the first line, I'm going to think we're going to get a lot of alliteration throughout. And I'm going to kind of expect that. I'm going to expect that that's part of the voice, that that's purposeful. So if that's true, if all those things are true, I would keep it and I'd keep doing it. But if it's like, lol, this just came out and it's interesting, but then I'm never going to do it again, then that's probably something you want to cut out just because you're probably directing your reader's attention. Alliteration is something that's going to be an attention grabber, right? It's a pattern. We're going to see like those same sounds, we're going to see those same letters, and so if we're having a pattern like that at the very beginning, we're just going to expect it. So I would think about what expectations are you setting. Is that an expectation you want to set or not? Does that help?
A bit.
Sorry?
A bit. I find myself often doing it inadvertently when it's a thing that happens a lot for me personally.
Well, we all, so you're saying that's something that happens a lot personally, and I think we all have kind of things we do where we don't think about it that are in our writing. And so there's two options with that, right? You can really roll into that and make that a thing that happens a lot, and that can be a character trait of your voice. The other direction is that you just got to edit it out a lot, and that both of those are perfectly fine answers depending on what you want your work to do. Again, first 10 drafts are going to be messy. So whatever you choose, I don't think there's necessarily a wrong answer as long as it's doing what you want the work to do. Yes?
Yeah. What if you have a really good opening line with a nice hook and it's got a good voice, but it hasn't found its forever home? You don't know what character it is, what they're motivated to do, what the story is. What would you recommend for developing that?
Great question. So what do you do if you've got this awesome first line, but then you don't know a lot of other things about its home yet? You know, who's the character, what's the world? I say save all those kind of things, because maybe you don't know at this moment, but with time you will probably, pieces will start coming together. So save everything. It will probably find a home at some point. But if you want to more actively figure that out, I think you can start asking questions because you've got something to work with, right? If you know that first line, you know some things to be true about that world. So I would start maybe digging into that, who would say this sort of thing? What else, what do we know about them so far? And based on what we know, what might they want? What might be getting in their way? Where are they? So you do have a great starting point. So maybe you just kind of keep digging into that. And if you're not ready to dig into it, keep it on the side and see if you find pieces along the way. I find places like MAGFest, I discover all sorts of things that then I put them together and go, I've got a new story. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, so we've got some folks lined up for first lines. Let's hear it.
Okay, so this is from a new adult LGBT plus genre.
Awesome. Is there a staffer here real quick? There's no staffer, okay. Because I just want to make sure I hear you. Can people hear her?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chapter 1, Felix. He kissed Johnny goodbye and watched him leave for work. If he had known it was the last time he would ever kiss Johnny, he would have made the kiss more than just a quick peck on the lips.
Awesome. So that's great because we got two characters and we feel that tension. We know, even from you read, I guess technically the first two sentences, but I think even in that first sentence we knew that there was the goodbye. So we knew that there was this relationship, there was this love, but that there's some reason that they can't be together at this moment. And that's great tension because then we wonder, why? Why can't they be together? What's going wrong? And we want to know more about those characters. And we already feel empathy because we know that there's love and we want to see them together. Yay. So awesome. Great work.
Hello, let me make sure that I can be heard. Am I close enough to the mic? Good. This is from a short story that is, the genre would be, I guess, pastoral horror.
Pastoral horror. That's a new one. I like that.
You built this coop with your own two hands and all of the crappy, twisted lumber you could buy from Lowe's. You did your research. It's lined with hardware cloth, not chicken wire, and it's buried 6 inches below the ground to deter digging predators. Despite all your efforts, your birds lie dead.
Ooh. Could you read the first sentence one more time?
You built this coop with your own two hands and all of the crappy, twisted lumber you could buy from Lowe's.
Ooh, okay. So I really love that it's second person. I have a special heart for second person, and that pulls me in right away. I love the specificity of the supplies that they use. That makes me think that this person is quite knowledgeable, which makes it really shocking for that third line, that they're still, that despite all that work, the chickens are dead. The one thing I'm wondering is if there's any way, and I don't know if we need this because you get to it still very early, but if there's a way to rearrange a little bit that we get the chickens, like I almost wonder if we should start with despite all your hard work, the chickens are dead, or something like that, and then we kind of go into the details. Just because I think that that's even stronger, though your first sentence was already very strong. So I might play with the rearranging and see if you like that more.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, great work.
Sorry, my phone's slow.
Oh, no, you're good.
So this is from the prologue of a sci-fi action adventure.
Okay.
I just had it here a second ago.
Okay, great. If you could just speak up a little bit.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Annika didn't know much about the world. In fact, she didn't know much outside the quaint solar farm her family had installed long ago. She knew the energy was vital to the nearby colony city. She knew her parents were in charge, chained to a career that induced vomit every time she was reminded that she was expected to take it up someday. Annika also knew what she wanted, and she knew that it wasn't that.
Interesting. So we get some world building right away. We see this girl that's been isolated on a farm, and you literally said she doesn't know a lot about the world right away. And I think that's interesting. I think the image with the vomiting was so strong that really pulled me in. One thing that struck me is that, trying to think of how to word this. You said, like, she knew what she wanted, but it wasn't that. I'm wondering if there's a way for us to be shown that instead of told that explicitly, because we're getting a lot of information told to us right away. Okay. So, and it's all really important information. I might see if there's ways that you can be even sneakier of how we kind of get that instead of being told she wants this or she doesn't want this, like the vomit, because that image is so powerful. If there's a way that maybe through what's happening that we can kind of see what she wants instead of being told that.
Okay.
That's just something I would think about, but it sounds like a really great opening.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Hello. Okay, can you hear me? We're good?
Yes.
All right. So I guess this one, I don't know how to define. It's like new adult, young adult, kind of a mix in between, like dark fantasy. So think like Spiderwick, but like older. Like
how old is the protagonist?
She's like 20 is her age, so kind of like...
Is right on.
I like writing about like college students and like young age. She's not a college student, but
I think you could say upper young adult.
Upper young adult. Okay, yeah. There we go. So like dark fantasy. So yes. First chapter. If her spell fizzled one more time, Vega was going to explode. She could feel her magic welling up inside of her, volatile and unstable and frustrated.
Was it skull was the word in the first sentence? She could feel what?
Which part?
Could you read the first sentence?
Yeah, if her spell fizzled one more time, Vega was going to explode.
So if her spell fizzled one more time. Okay, cool. Interesting. I like that first one, we get conflict right away. Like if this happens one more time, she's gonna be like, ah. So we get the sense right away that we're in the fantastical because there's a spell. Yeah, that's interesting. Are the next sentences going to give us a little bit more information about the spell itself?
Yeah, I could actually read into the next paragraph if you want to. It gives a little more context. It definitely does. That's like the first two sentences. Like
okay.
The first.
Yeah, for our purposes now, don't read it just because I want us to have time for everyone. But the one question I did have in that sentence, which is a good question because it's pulling me forward, is I want to know more about that kind of spell. What world are we in? How do spells work? What kind of spells? And you don't have to answer all those immediately, but that made me think in the next few sentences, I hope we're going to learn a little bit more about that magic and that spell. So that's just one thought. So great work.
Thank you.
I'd want to read more, so. These are all great lines, everyone. Thanks so much for sharing. Hey.
Hello. All right, so I've been working on this science fantasy story like in the far future. I have mine start in the middle of an action scene, which I've heard like mixed things about, so I guess I'd like to get your opinion on it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would recommend a hasty withdrawal. A curt professional voice rang in Abe's ears as the pillars of dark spellfire erupted all around them, the roaring flames melting through rebar and concrete and bringing the rest of the ruined building down around them. She could only detect the slightest hint of panic from Tet, which seemed entirely warranted given the situation they found themselves in.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I think it works because what I think is great when you do something like that and you do it effectively there, we get into the action with that first line, like, I recommend you retreat. I can't remember the exact words, but that was kind of the vibe, right? And then you slow down a sentence or two and you give us a little bit of the scenery. And so we're getting a sense of world building, where we are. I think one thing that as it continues, the good question that's interesting me then is I want to know about that protagonist. I want to know a little bit more about them. And I think maybe the reason that there's some debate about opening in the action is that we maybe don't always as easily get as much information about the character. We can. It's a great opportunity to do so because we see them in action. So we can see what are they doing, and we're going to learn about them through that. But often we can get so excited about the action we forget that part. So I just encourage you, if you haven't already, maybe like read through and check, or you're like, oh, I'm already doing this, just make sure we're getting some sense of who that character is as a unique person through that action, so that we'll be even further pulled on, because the plot is pulling us now. So now my question would be, is the character going to be grabbing us as well? So, but great work. I think that's a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, so this is from a post-apocalyptic Taoist parable.
Oh, okay, that's a new genre. I love it.
And I want to say that there are essentially two first opening lines because there are also chapter titles.
Oh, well, that's fair.
We have Dip Your Toes in a Little Bit of Massacre.
Oh, I like that. That pulls us in.
A guy with a track record like mine owes it to himself to avoid places like this. Tragedy is not exactly an acquired taste, but for people like me, when there is a fire and you're next to it, it gives people the wrong idea. Nice. And then it continues to describe an annihilated city.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, one, I love how you read it. Great work, because it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to read our work. I love the title, and I love the two lines. They both pull me in. What I love about the two lines is that you get the voice, you get that stance, right? He's like a person like me in a place like this. And so I'm getting a sense of who this person is, the rules of how this place works. I mean, I'm trusting them so far. Maybe they're an unreliable narrator. But that's interesting. The two questions that are good questions that are pulling me there is, what is this place and who is a person like me? So I'm expecting in that first chapter, we're going to learn more of what is this place, as you just said you were about to do, and what's the type of person that this is. So great job hooking us.
All right.
Hi there.
Hey.
This is from a new adult sci-fi story, begins in chapter 1 from the perspective of the antagonist.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear? Okay, awesome.
Time had ceased to mean anything an eternity ago. Her lips, dry, chapped lips, rasped together as she slouched against the wall of her cell. Her dark hair tumbled around her shoulders. It hung matted with oil and dust and sweat as the electric grid crackled above her head, the only source of light.
Ooh, can you read the first sentence one more time?
Sure. Time had ceased to mean anything an eternity ago.
I like that takes a stance and that sets world, so we know that we're not dealing in our linear human timeline there. I liked, there was something about the electric grid that was very visceral to me, and so I really liked that pulled me in. One thing I'm wondering about, you did a great job describing what the antagonist looked like, and that's really important details. I'm wondering if for the first lines, if we can get a little bit more of what's going on before we slow down that much, because you gave us that line that really pulls me about eternity, and so I'm like, that's making me want to know a little bit more about the world. So I might play with the order of things in your first chapter, because I'm expecting that you're probably going to give us a little bit more information about that world. So I might see if the description, because what I try and think about with my openings is what do my readers need to know in this exact moment? And so I'm wondering if there's some other information you have that might be even stronger moving up forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, great work. Are we doing good? Okay.
All right. So this is a near future sci-fi set in a realm where people are getting biological enhancements and AR and VR. Ray starts off in a hospital. So I was playing around with starting off with onomatopoeia, taking a little risk. It starts in this manner. Drip, drip, drip. Start, Raymond. You just have to get started. Wait. Where the hell am I? A cold, wet rush flushes through Raymond's spine. That's the first line.
Nice. Can you read the first sentence again? Because the jam space drowned out after the drip.
Okay.
A little bit. So I just want to make sure I captured it all. And make sure to speak nice and loudly to fight the jam space.
Start, Raymond. You just have to get started.
Oh, right. We just have to get started. I thought the strongest part of what you read was the where the heck am I? So I love onomatopoeia, and I love it because like there that viscerally puts us in place, and I think it works well with the where we are question, and the I just have to get started is also interesting. But the question, I almost wonder if that's the strongest part to start, and then we kind of get a little bit more of that information. So I might just play with the order a little bit, because you're giving us good questions, because we're wondering too, then like, oh, where are we, you know? So, and then I want to know more, of course, but that might even hook us more to have is the first thing.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
great work.
Appreciate it.
So this is sort of the opening of something that I would eventually want to develop into sort of a crossbreed between something Lovecraftian and something that Stephen King may write.
Okay, cool.
The title is The Haunting in Pewter Stand.
Okay.
Okay. Most stories about terrible tragedies start something like, it started as a day like any other. I wish I could say the same about what happened in Pewter Stand. If for whatever godforsaken reason you find yourself in that backwoods podunk hole of a town, do not look under the floorboards.
Ooh. I like that it sets place as character. I want to know about this city.
The idea is that it would be told by more or less the only survivor about what happened, and it would retell the lead up, the downfall, and a hint at maybe what happened, but leaving the actual cause unclear.
Interesting, okay. Well, I think the way you set that up works well. I expect that kind of format, what you described. I'm like, I'm getting the vibe of that from the first line. I'm really interested in this place. I'm interested in this person. Because they make a claim in the beginning of like, I wish I could say it started like any other day, which made me interested of like, well, why do they wish it started like any other day? Because obviously everything went wrong.
I have another sentence that elaborates on how bad it got.
We've got a bunch of people behind you. I would love to hear it, but due to time. So, but that's good. If you can answer and say, the next sentence addresses that, then that's fantastic. So, to me, it sounds like you got a great start. So just keep going. Well done.
Hello.
Hello.
This is just regular fiction. I'm trying to finish this novel, and it's going to be kind of like a comedy thing.
Okay, make sure to speak up and be close. You're fighting the jam space.
Sorry.
You're good.
So opening. So, do you understand what I'm saying? You need to work on yourself first and get yourself right first. See a therapist on your own, but I will say, don't expect the therapist to fix everything. You could still be messed up after. He gave her this serious look to make sure she realized therapy might not fix her.
Interesting, okay. I like the device of the dialogue. So when we start in dialogue, that's going to give characters to bounce off each other. And what's interesting about that is it feels like that first sentence, I suspect that might almost be like a thesis statement for the story, or something that the story is going to kind of talk about a lot. And that's often about the 5% mark, but I like that you're doing it right away. It kind of gives me some expectations of how we're going to talk about a character dealing with whatever they need to work through. And it's interesting, the protagonist fights back against that and says like, I'm not sure that's easy as therapy, or I don't remember exactly how they said that, which makes me curious of if that's going to prove true, or if that character is going to learn like, actually therapy was maybe more helpful than I thought. And so I'm curious of how it's going to go. I'm curious of more to know more about that character, why they say that, and how they're gonna deal with whatever they're dealing with. So good job. That sounds like a good start.
This is for a custom fantasy setting I've made for myself.
Awesome. Make sure to speak loud and be close to the mic.
Okay, I don't know how, I usually get very loud, so I don't know how loud I want to be.
You're quiet right now, so.
Okay, all right, I'll try to be a little louder.
Okay.
He'd been lost for years. The crunching snow beneath his bare feet and hunger were his only companions roaming these frozen lands. His whole life, he'd been raised under the rules of the wild. To survive was the only goal. Yet despite his family's teachings and his body capable of hunting and fending off the weather, the breaking of tree and bone alike, simple tasks, He could not still fight off the painful cold he was left with so long ago.
Interesting. So in that last part, it sounds like cold is literal and metaphoric, right? So he's got bare feet, and I love that detail because that's so visceral, and I go, oh, that's so cold. But then it sounds like that's going to be more about like also loneliness at large. One observation to me was that details like the bare feet really stuck with me and were like really strong to me. And then there's some parts after that where we get really important info, but it's explained to us a little bit about the backstory. So I'm wondering if there's ways you can be a little sneaky with how we get that information, maybe through details. Are there objects that he has that kind of can tell us some of that backstory of, I think you said being raised by wolves or something like that. So is there an object from like a wolf that maybe is meaningful to him that he's carrying, or something like that? Just because that's going to be how we remember that backstory information even more powerfully than being told it. So that might be something I play with, but I think the first line you've got is a particularly strong one to start with. So great work.
Thank you.
We are getting close to, so before you read, I'm just going to say, we're getting close to the end of time, so I just want to do a couple announcements. I will stay around, so if you've got additional questions, the last folks that are here for first lines, I will stick around and hear that, so please feel free to stay. Please rate in good guidebook how you felt about the panel. That's really helpful for us. And finally, shameless plug, I've got free swag here. Please feel free to take that. If you didn't get a handout and you'd like a handout, or you'd like to sign up for my newsletter, please make a note of that on this paper so I can do that. And thank you so much for being here. This was such a great engaged crowd, so I really appreciate y'all being here.